Hello and welcome to the Japan Zoomina at UC San Diego. It's October 5th, 2021, and our topic today is the U.S. Japan Treaty, or Anpo. I'm Ulrike Schede, professor of Japanese business at UC San Diego. I'm also the director of JFIT, the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology. We are at GPS, the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego, where we have various masters, including one of international affairs with a Japan specialization. If you're interested in our course offerings, please visit gps.ucsd.edu. And our Japan Center is also there at jfit.ucsd.edu. If you go to that JFIT website, you can follow us. You can also follow me on Twitter and LinkedIn and so forth. But if you go to the website, you can find under the News and Media tab an opportunity to sign up for our biweekly San Diego Japan newsflash. And right next to it is the Japan Zoominar button, where you can go and find not only upcoming events, but also our brand new JZ gallery, which I'll introduce in a moment. Please note that our Zoominars are recorded. And so when we have the Q&A section later, I will only refer to you by first name to ensure that your privacy is protected. So this is our brand new JZ gallery, pretty spiffy looking. Here we have all of our past events separated into 4 boxes. And today, of course, we're doing the lower right-hand side, arts, culture, history, and more. And if you were to go there, you would find past events. You can click, and that'll take you to the recording. While you're on that website, it would be absolutely lovely if you could look at the support button, which is on the far right side. This is where you can help us continue this work. We're a non-for-profit organization. I can't sell this Zoominar, and so I'm dependent on people who help us keep this going. So thank you for your consideration. So we're doing this every 2 weeks. Today, of course, we're doing the Anpo, as I already said. Coming up, October 19th, is basically a follow-up on what we're going to talk about today, namely are America's allies in the Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific, aging. This will be about the national security implications of demographic change, and we'll have Andrew Orrs from Washington College talking with my dear colleague, Alice Krauss. On November 2nd, on the occasion of various elections, namely in Japan, Germany, and on that day, the United States, I'll have Axel Klein from Germany and Ken McElwain from the University of Tokyo to discuss the various developments there, including whether Prime Minister Kishida will actually make it. And on November 16th, we'll go back to one of our longstanding topics, which is energy, and discuss Asia's long exit from overseas coal financing with Toshiyuki Sakamoto from Eniken and Michael Davidson, my colleague here. All right, enough of this. Let's turn to Nick. Nick Kapur is the author of Japan at the Crossroads, and I will actually now stop my slides so that I can introduce him. Here we go. Hey, Nick, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So let me introduce you. So Nick Kapur is a historian of modern Japan and East Asia, and his focus is on pre-war, World War II, and post-war Japan. He's an associate professor of history at Rutgers University. He earned his BA and MA Stanford. He actually originally hails from Southern California, so it's always great to have a SoCal guest. His PhD is from Harvard in history, and he works on the intersection, very interestingly, on the intersection of political economy, culture, and international relations. Also, the history dimensions of environment, gender, literature, and film. So it's a very broad portfolio of your work on post-war Japan. Nick has also published various papers, including The Empire Strikes Back, which is about the rise of nationalism, which is a recent paper, and a translation of Oguma Eiji's Japan 1968. Maybe we'll get to that before we're done here today, since we're talking about the 60s. So today we want to talk about his book, which is absolutely fantastic, I actually am just teaching a class on business management in Japan this quarter, and I assigned your chapter 1, which is about the 50s, and it perfectly lays the ground of how Japan's post-war political economy came about. And that's really what we want to talk about today. You make a pretty strong point there about how the Anpo demonstrations were really one of the largest movements of popular unrest in Japan and shaped Japan until the present. So thank you very much, Nick, for joining us. It's great to have you.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thank you to everyone for being here today. I'm thrilled to be part of this series, which I've often participated in as a viewer. And also thank you so much to Professor Sheda for inviting me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because there's some great images of these protests, which I'd like to share with you. Okay, so in the spring and summer of 1960, Japan experienced the largest popular protests in its modern history. And at issue was an attempt by the US-supported conservative government to revise and extend the U.S. Japan Security Treaty, which is abbreviated Anpo in Japanese. And this is the treaty that allows the United States to maintain military bases on Japanese soil to this day. The central figure in the revision of the treaty was the prime minister at the time, Kishi Nobusuke. He was a former bureaucrat in Japanese-occupied Manchuria, and he had served in the wartime cabinet of General Tojo Hideki. So here's the wartime cabinet, and here is our friend Kishi Nobusuke. After the war, Kishi had been indicted as a Class A war criminal during the Tokyo war crimes trials, but he was saved from conviction and possible execution at the last moment thanks to the so-called reverse course in the US occupation. And so Kishi was depurged and allowed to return to politics in order to help the United States fight the Cold War. Now, Kishi had obvious reactionary tendencies. For example, as prime minister in 1958, he tried to revise the national police law to make the Japanese police a little bit more like the pre-war thought police. And Kishi openly talked about revising the Constitution to get rid of Article 9 and remilitarize Japan. And so many people on both sides of the political spectrum actually kind of disliked Kishi or agreed that perhaps he was trying to take Japan back to the pre-war era in certain ways. Of course, as some people may know, Kishi was also the grandfather of Abe Shinzo, the recent prime minister of Japan. And so here's a photograph of Kishi with Abe on his lap as a young toddler. Now, Kishi, when he became prime minister, he knew he was fairly unpopular, and he hoped that he could win popularity back and secure his legacy by revising this U.S. Japan Security Treaty, which was equally, if not more unpopular in Japan. And so he thought he could get it revised to be more fair and more of an equal treaty. In order to get the United States to agree to revise this treaty, Kishi spent many years kind of buttering up American leaders and telling them what they wanted to hear and emphasizing how he would support them in the Cold War. And he kissed up so much to the United States that he did become quite popular among American businessmen and political leaders, so much so that they started calling him, quote, our man in Japan. He even made the cover of Time magazine. So here's a picture of Kishi, and you see that phoenix in the background. He's portrayed as a phoenix rising from the ashes of wartime Japan and perhaps his own past as a war criminal, at least a suspected one. So after several years of negotiations, Kishi finally did succeed in getting a revision of this security treaty in 1960. And the new treaty was in fact much more equal and much better than the old security treaty, which had been sort of forced on Japan as a condition of ending the US occupation in 1952. And so all these flaws were fixed in the new treaty. And so Kishi returned to Japan expecting to be hailed as a hero. But he was in for a rude surprise. The problem was that many Japanese people, and not just on the left, but many on the right as well, they didn't want any security treaty. They did not want to be in a subordinate position to the United States. Rather, they wanted no treaty at all. They wanted all the US military bases out of Japan entirely. And so over a period of more than a year, a broad nationwide protest movement arose in opposition to the treaty and this revision of it, which started out with a lot of leftist groups, especially political parties, labor unionists, student groups, but it grew larger and larger, and more types of organizations started joining centrist civic organizations, and even by the end, some conservative business groups as well. They opposed the treaty on sort of nationalist grounds, get the US bases out. And the strategy of the anti-treaty movement was to try to block revision of the treaty entirely, even though the new treaty was better than the old one. And then meanwhile, in the Diet, the opposition Japan Socialist Party pursued a strategy of delay. They used a variety of parliamentary maneuvers to try to gum up the works of the treaty approval process. And Kishi had made a rather unfortunate mistake in his handling of the treaty. He was so confident that everyone would love this revised treaty that he invited US President Dwight Eisenhower to come to Japan in June 1960 to celebrate the new treaty. And he thought 6 months between January and June would be plenty of time to get it through the Diet. But debate kept dragging on, and it looked more and more like the treaty would not be approved in time for Eisenhower's arrival. And so Kishi became more and more desperate and angry, and he was trying to find some way to cut off the endless debate in the Diet. And then finally in May, with Eisenhower's arrival just 1 month away, Kishi met in secret with his closest allies and advisors, a group that he grimly dubbed the Anpo Kamikaze Squad, and he came up with a desperate plan. And so on May 19th, 1960, Kishi shocked the opposition parties and many members of his own Liberal Democratic Party who had not been told of this plan when he suddenly called for a snap vote on the treaty and cut off all debate. And this was technically legal, but it violated longstanding parliamentary norms. And so when the Japan Socialist Party attempted a sit-in in the halls of the Diet to prevent this, Kishi then introduced 500 police officers to the National Diet and had his opponents physically removed from the Diet. And then he rammed the new treaty through with only members of his own party present. And so this is a famous image from this moment where you see on the far right, where the opposition lawmakers would normally sit is totally empty, and only some members of the LDP were there, and they use a voice vote to just ram the treaty through. Now, this was widely seen as an anti-democratic maneuver, and it outraged much of the nation. Even members of Kishi's own party were calling for his resignation. Even conservative media outlets were shocked and called for him to resign. So at this moment, the protest movement gets really, really huge and expands beyond sort of people in the center or on the left. At the climax of the protests in mid-June, the Diet building was the focus of enormous protest gatherings on a near daily basis. On June 10th, 1960, a car carrying Eisenhower's press secretary, James Hagerty, was mobbed outside Tokyo's Haneda airport by protesters. Hagerty had just arrived to prepare for Eisenhower's visit, and these protesters rocked the car back and forth, slashed its tires, smashed its headlights, danced on the roof of it for more than an hour until the occupants were finally rescued by a US Marines helicopter in what became known as the infamous Hagerty incident. So here's the helicopter landing. Here, the occupants of the car getting in the helicopter. The protesters are beating on it with placards. And then finally the helicopter got away. And of course, the sign that the protesters holding in this photograph says Anpo Hantai, we're down with the security treaty. And then the climax of the protest, the day of largest protests was June 15th, when right-wing gangsters attacked a group of peaceful protest marchers in the afternoon, injuring more than 80 people, as captured in this photograph. And then shortly thereafter, thousands of enraged student activists from the Zengakuren Student Federation smashed their way into the Diet compound itself. They pushed through the gates, overturning and lighting on fire 19 police paddy wagons, and then hurling their unarmed bodies again and again into the massed lines of police armed with clubs, fighting long into the night to repossess the Diet in the name of the Japanese people. And the grounds of the Diet ran red with blood. The bodies of students beaten unconscious were piled up on the ground, awaiting ambulances to take them to hospitals. And in one of the final charges, a female Tokyo University student named Kamba Michiko was trampled to death. News of this violence, and above all Kamba's death, stunned the nation. And in the eyes of many Japanese people, the death of this female student activist was a triple tragedy. First of all, because she was so young and she had her whole life ahead of her. Second of all, because she was a student at Japan's most elite university, Tokyo University. And perhaps most of all, and thirdly, because she was a female. And this was at a time when, in many cases, women were still not allowed on the front lines of protest marches. They were supposed to be in the rear for support or serving tea or something like that. And so this was very shocking to the whole country that, in particular, was a female student that was killed. And so together with the Haggerty incident and the bloodshed of the Diet on June 15th, and most of all, Kamba Michiko's death, these events caused everyone on all sides to pause and reconsider. And Kishi's own cabinet effectively forced him to resign. And perhaps even more humiliating, cancel Eisenhower's much hyped visit. Now, the announcement of Kishi's resignation and the cancellation of Ike's visit took the wind out of the sails of this protest movement. And although the treaty protests continued until June 19th, and there was another massive protest in front of the Diet that evening as it became June 20th, June 18th, and then as it became June 19th, the treaty automatically took effect according to Japanese law, and thereafter the protest movement rapidly died away. However, and this is where my own research really begins, as I argue in a variety of different dimensions in my recent book, Japan at the Crossroads, the impact of these protests on U.S.-Japan relations and also on Japanese politics and society and culture was only just beginning. And so in this book, I really take a look at the aftermath of these protests. And the reason I got into this project dates back many years to when I was an undergraduate and I first read about the 1960 Anpo protests, and to my own kind of shock and amazement at the fact that these protests were so large and they had this violent climax in June 1960. And this jarred with my experience of visiting Japan in more recent times. Of course, there are still large-scale protests in Okinawa, where the majority of the United States bases still are, and Okinawa has this unequal burden. But in mainland Japan, especially in Tokyo, it's really hard to even imagine walking the streets of Tokyo today, protests of this size and magnitude and kind of intensity happening in the Japan of nowadays. And so I kind of wanted to understand, how did we get from there to now? What changed, sort of both intended and unintended, in the years since 1960 to make it hard to maybe even imagine this kind of protest? Now, obviously, I couldn't write a book about all 60 years from 1960 to now. That would be many, many books. So I decided to focus on the 1960s, the immediate aftermath, and see sort of what began to change in those early years in the immediate aftermath that might help us understand how we have the Japan that we have nowadays. I just want to end by giving you a sort of very quick overview of some of what's in the book and some of my conclusions that I came up with in this research. So I have a chapter-length introduction, which Professor Sheda already mentioned. This examines the causes and course of the 1960 Anpo protests, but it begins on August 15, 1945, with Emperor Hirohito's surrender message, and really goes through the 1950s and the background of these protests, and then dives into the protest movement itself and explains what happened. And really what I'm trying to show in this chapter is, in my view, the 1960 protests were a culmination of a longer history in the 1950s of increasingly violent and fierce partisan conflict between left and right in Japan, which in my view is a legacy of the sort of contradictions of the US occupation in Japan after World War II. And this chapter, I deliberately wrote it to be very readable and accessible because I felt there wasn't something of this length out there for people just want to understand what these protests were about. And so in that regard, I think this is a good chapter to assign if people are teaching about these protests themselves. But then the rest of the book is what happens after the protests. Sort of, it begins when the protests end in June 1960. So chapter 1 considers efforts to repair U.S. Japan relations in the aftermath of the protests, with a focus on the administrations of the two men in the bottom of this photograph, President John F. Kennedy and Prime Minister Ikeda Hayato, who was Kishi's successor. And these two leaders, along with the US Ambassador, Edwin O. Reischauer, who you see in the back row, second from the right, they worked to reformulate the US-Japan relationship into more of a mutual alliance based on a greater degree of cooperation, especially behind the scenes. And what emerged was a framework whereby the US president would inform the Japanese government in advance before making major new policy announcements in the realm of foreign policy and other areas that might affect Japan. And this was supposed to be a level of consideration on par with that extended to Great Britain. And in addition, the two countries negotiated what I call a foundational compromise, whereby the United States traded greater economic access to US markets in exchange for much more explicit Japanese support for US Cold War policies and objectives. Chapter 2 turns to domestic politics, and in particular, the steps taken by Prime Minister Ikeda Hayato to stabilize conservative politics and the Liberal Democratic Party in the aftermath of these protests. And I argue that Ikeda turned the LDP into much more of a big tent party in a way that would allow it to retain power for many decades up to the present time. He did this by deliberately altering his public persona and taking a stance very diametrically opposed to that taken by Kishi, the so-called low posture, in contrast to Kishi's belligerence. He promoted a politics of, quote, tolerance and patience toward the opposition parties. And of course, most famously of all, he sought to redirect popular energies away from contentious street protests towards a new national consensus around promoting GDP growth above all, by launching his income doubling plan, which was a sort of economic moonshot, which promised to double Japan's GDP in just 10 years, and in fact, doubled it in just 7. Chapter 3 looks at what happened after 1960 to the left-wing opposition parties, the Japan Socialist Party, the Japan Communist Party, and the new breakaway Democratic Socialist Party shown here. And in particular, I highlight schisms within the opposition that made it increasingly difficult for them to oppose conservatives going forward. And I argue that these schisms were driven by profound disagreements over whether the Anpo protests had been a success that should be replicated or a failure to be avoided. Chapter 4 looks at the other major elements of the broad center-left coalition that carried out these massive protests in 1960, in particular the labor movement, the student movement, intellectuals such as Maruyama Masao, Yoshimoto Takaki, and Shimizu Ikutaro, who supported the protest movement in different ways. And all of these groups and these intellectuals had various schisms and disagreements that grew out of the ambiguous outcome of the protest movement. On one hand, they succeeded in toppling the conservative government of Prime Minister Kishi, and Eisenhower's visit was canceled. But on the other hand, they didn't stop the treaty. And so people couldn't agree on what these protests meant. And so eventually, all of these groups that had supported this broad coalition collapse in various ways. Even parts of the peace movement, such as the anti-A-bomb organization Gensuikyo, the Japan Mothers Conference, they had their own schisms as well, arguing over these protests. And so in the end, the coalition collapses. However, as I explore at the end of this chapter, the decline of these old left groups allowed for the emergence of new types of movements, such as a feminist movement, environmentalist movement, and so-called residence movements, or Jumi Undo. Chapter 5 turns to Japanese literature, film, and the arts. A vast majority of artists and writers in Japan participated in the protest movement in 1960, and the years around 1960 saw an explosion of new forms of literature, art, film, dance, music, photography, on and on and on. And so I examine in this chapter the roles that artists' participation in this mass movement played in shaping their art theory and practice going forward. And in particular, I highlight how the experience of the protests helped artists and writers break away from the stifling influence of the Japan Communist Party and artistic dogmas in the 1950s, such as reportage and socialist realism. And then lastly, chapter 6 charts a conservative counter-revolution that shaped the contours of freedom of expression in Japan going forward. Police forces were drastically expanded, and the police contrived new methods for discouraging public displays of dissent. The courts helped criminalize certain types of public assembly going forward. The media engaged in a much greater degree of self-censorship to prevent new protest movements from emerging. And lastly, there was an explosion of right-wing violence in the 1960s, including a wave of assassinations and assassination attempts that reminded some people of a similar wave of assassinations back in the 1930s. And I investigate the stifling effect that this right-wing violence and then continued right-wing activism, maybe not quite as violent, but different types of right-wing activism going forward. I examine how that had a stifling effect on artistic and journalistic expression in Japan that is maybe in some ways still with us. And of course, this is one of the most famous photographs in all of modern Japanese history of the right-wing ultranationalist youth Yamaguchi Otoya assassinating Socialist Party Chairman Asanuma Inejiro in fall 1960, right after these protests. These right-wing groups were terrified that the protests were the sign of a coming communist revolution, and so they were motivated to take drastic action. And so that's a little bit of a taste of what's inside the book and some of my findings. I'm happy to discuss more of this in the Q&A, and I'll just end at Professor Shada's request with one more image of snake dance. So this is something I talk a little bit about in my book. This was a unique form of a Japanese protest march in which people would lock arms and make a giant snake, and they would march extremely quickly. You can look up videos of this on YouTube. It's quite impressive how fast they march, and the snake careens across the road, occupying public space to express their anger at the treaty. And actually, protesters around the world tried to imitate this dance, including in the United States, like at the protests in 1968 at the Chicago Democratic National Convention. But they had a lot of trouble because it's actually quite hard to match your steps while marching so quickly. And so kind of comically, these protesters in other countries would crash into each other and fall over. So anyway, this is a fun aspect of these protests, I think, a very interesting protest march that existed in Japan at that time. Anyway, I'll stop there, and I very much look forward to our conversation and answering questions anyone might have. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Nick. This is terrific. And, great overview. And I should also say that the book is exceedingly well written. So it's a lot of fun to read this. I was particularly, before I invite the audience, we already have a few questions. So audience, please write your questions in the Q&A. I'll kind of try to weave it into our conversation. But let me start out with a couple of observations that I had reading the book. The first was that the language was very interesting. So there was this one of the initial coalitions that when the intellectuals joined the protest, and they had a play on word about, they made kaikaku into kai-aku, where it was something like, it wasn't the reform, it was the undoing the reform, or the making it worse situation of the Anpo. So the language there, you must have gotten a huge kick out of some of these, the play on words and the language that comes also out through the text.
Yeah, I mean, one of the fun parts of doing this project is, as I alluded to, the fact that so many writers and artists were involved in this movement. It's pretty hard to find any, you name any famous like filmmaker, or artist, or writer, or poet, or anything from the post-war period that we've ever heard of. And if you check, they almost certainly participate in this movement. I mean, the sole exception is some very famous right-wing writers and stuff, but even some of the right-wingers or people that later became right-wingers, I mean, Ishihara Shintaro or Eto Jun, or some of these people were protesting against this treaty. And so, you get a lot of interesting artwork, kind of drawings of Kishi that they're carrying in the protest marches, and then some of this wordplay, or kind of treating it as an artistic event at the same time it's a political protest. So it is fun to look at that stuff, and yeah, calling it the kayaku, and punning on the word reform and changing it into like drastically worsening, right? Yeah.
So Perry actually had a question on this. And so I'll bring it in here because it fits. So the question is whether you could say a little bit more about the specific contradictions of the U.S. Occupation that became the catalyst. So what were people actually angry at? So you lay out how this was a big improvement, and sort of the Iron Curtain speech had changed the U.S. stance, and so they wanted to change the treaty. But why were they so angry?
Yeah, so the contradictions in the U.S. occupation, really what I was referring to there is the so-called reverse course, right? So when the U.S. occupation starts, the goal of the occupation, and actually this official State Department history of the U.S. occupation of Japan actually even says this, that the initial goal was to punish Japan and to sort of damage Japan's prospects going forward so that it would not be able to threaten the world again with its military power. And so as part of this, they deliberately take steps that they think might hurt Japan. Of course, they break up all the industrial conglomerates, but they release all the communists from prison. It's sort of like, this is your punishment in a way. It's not that they were necessarily in favor of communism, but they also empower labor unions to an extent far beyond how much power labor unions had in the United States even. And so they're unleashing these sort of forces of leftism in Japan, and maybe even as part of Japan's punishment for daring to wage war against the United States. And then this extremely liberal constitution, which enshrines women's rights and labor rights and various rights and privileges far beyond what the Meiji Constitution had, and beyond what even the US Constitution has, far beyond that. So this initial phase of the occupation unleashes the forces of leftism in Japan and sort of gives people on the left a right to believe in some sense that maybe their vision of Japan's future is even the one that might prevail. But then, of course, as you mentioned, the Iron Curtain comes down, and then US leaders, especially back in Washington, say, hey, wait a minute. And then especially when China falls to the communists, we need Japan as a sort of unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Pacific, our last bastion when China has fallen and North Korea is there. And so they start reversing and try to undo all these reforms and empower the right in Japan. That's when they depurge Kishi. They start urging Japan to remilitarize, actually. And so now the right is empowered, but the left still was empowered in some ways. They weren't able to totally reverse everything. And so I see the next decade in the 50s as really a sort of battle for the soul of Japan. What is going to be the future direction of Japan? Arising from this reverse course in the occupation where both left and right were empowered in different ways. And so they're fighting out and it becomes increasingly intense. There's incredible amounts of strikes and industrial and labor actions in the 50s, as I think we know, and getting more and more intense leading up to the Nikkei coal mine strike, which is the largest strike in Japanese history. And then increasingly intense political protests over bases and atomic testing and bases in particular. And so this kind of all culminates in 1960, who's going to win, left or right? And I think in the end, neither side wins. I think sort of the silent majority or the middle decides we don't want either the sort of return to more of a pre-war system that the right wants, or a turn towards maybe the communist bloc or Cold War neutralism that the left wanted. We just want to stay the course, keep the US alliance in place. Meanwhile, economic growth is taking off even more than was perhaps expected. And so people have an incentive, an economic incentive to sort of just stay the course and keep the status quo as it is. So kind of radical centrism but that requires keeping the U.S.-Japan alliance in place, at least for the time being. That's what most people wanted. And so I think that's what we end up with, and that's where we are still today.
So for me, one of the big points in your book was that actually these contradictions and throughout these protests, and then also in the 60s, still explain some of the contradictions we see today. That there's the old and the new, and the right and the left. Although we actually have a question on whether the right has been totally sanctioned and it's only the left is protesting. But also Yuriko reminds us, and I wanted to bring this in. Today's news is that the brand new Prime Minister Kishida has just announced he wants a new system of Japanese capitalism, which would take Japan back to Prime Minister Ikeda Hayato and his income doubling plan, and so somehow get the economy going and rise the water level for everybody in the society. And so can you talk a little bit more about these long-term traces that you see?
Yeah, exactly. So I think in all of these areas, I see we're still sort of left with the patterns and the institutions and the practices that are put in place after these protests to try to calm things down and keep this kind of protests from happening again, but also to stabilize conservative rule over Japan, sort of center-right rule. And it's interesting you bring up Kishida, right? Because Kishida is the head of Kochikai, which is Ikeda Hayato's faction that he founds in 1957, leading up to these protests. And so he's directly inheriting the legacy of Ikeda Hayato, where Ikeda was sort of nobody's first choice to be prime minister. And then they sort of pushed him into the office right after these huge protests when the LDP is so unpopular. Sort of everyone expected him to fail, and there's going to be an election in the fall, and they thought, well, he'll just be prime minister for a few months and then we'll go with somebody else. But then he pulls this income doubling plan out of his pocket and completely shifts the narrative. And one of my favorite parts in the book was this anecdote where he introduces the income doubling plan, and he so totally completely shifted the narrative from these contentious political issues and the treaty to economic growth, that even the left-wing parties have to come up with their own income doubling plans to try to fight with him in the election. But then he's already won because they're trying to fight on his turf. And it's such a big success that he does so well in the election, they can't get rid of him. And he actually, really is able to alter the course of which way the Conservative Party was headed, the LDP, and even to the point of taking constitutional revision off the table, which is a huge blow to the Socialist Party, because even people who maybe weren't ardent socialists had voted for them to try to block constitutional revision. But if the LDP itself is no longer saying that, then maybe that's not necessary. And so I see similarities with Kishida now, right? Because Suga was maybe the most unpopular prime minister since Kishi, because of his perhaps mishandling of the pandemic, and also the Olympics caused a lot of unhappiness in Japan, as we know. And so again, we see sort of the LDP turning to a candidate from this Kochikai faction, and maybe he's trying to take a page out of Ikeda's playbook, redirect the narrative or popular energies in a direction of some kind of moderate reform of Japanese capitalism, similar to what Ikeda did. I mean, you go on the Kochikai website and then they have a huge picture of Ikeda, and so it's all about that legacy, and maybe they're trying to repeat that game plan.
Or at least the announcement, if they can't do the reality of the
right.
So our colleague John reminds us that in 1968, in the Columbia University uprising in New York, several Japanese Zengakuren veterans actually held classes on snake dancing in Riverside Park. So that one brings me to a topic that I wanted to ask. So is there a connection, if any, between the 1960s? Was Japan a front runner in terms of just opening up the roaring 1960s? So I remember a conversation with a famous Japanese economist who was a student at Todai in the 60s. And I'm not sure whether it was in 1960 or a little later in the 60s, but the Todai, that was not a good place to be. There were factions that were fighting, and he reported how they actually wanted to burn down the library of the University of Tokyo. And he and a bunch of other people stood in front of the door and said, "Nah, that's really stupid. Let's not do that." Right? And so two questions: How does the student movement fit in there, and where did it go? Why was Japan so rambunctious then and had so many protests? And we no longer see that at all, right? Not even with the unions.
Okay, yeah, these are great questions. The second question is a huge question, and you could spend an hour answering it, but I definitely have thoughts. So the student movement, what's interesting about 1960 is that the student movement is still pretty united. So Zengakuren, this nationwide student federation, is founded in 1948. And it's a federation of all the student governments at every university in Japan. And so as long as it's united, it has tremendous manpower, or including women power as well, to get students out in the streets. But what happens is, sort of during the course of the 1960 Anpo protests, the student movement starts to fall apart, and it's these disagreements over, is this a success, or are we going down the wrong path? And then immediately afterward, it starts splintering more and more and more. And so it's no longer this united force that can turn all these students out for one cause. And then by the end of the 60s, like you mentioned, there's all these, they're called sects in Japanese, but they're with very minute doctrinal differences, or sometimes it's not even clear, but then they're fighting against each other at least as much as against police. And so you have this huge uprising in 68, 69, which is part of a broader global kind of uprising of the baby boom generation against the Cold War and overcrowded universities. But yeah, they barricade 141 campuses across Japan. Like spring exams are canceled for a whole year. People can't graduate. They're fighting with police, but they're also beating up each other and sometimes murdering other students. And so, I mean, there's some connection there. Those students in 68, 69 definitely saw themselves as the inheritors of sort of the Anpo spirit. They were still using Anpo, the security treaty, as a rallying cry for their protests in some regard. And they're looking forward to 1970 when the initial 10-year time frame of the treaty would expire, and they thought they could have huge protests against that. But it's a different type of student activism in a lot of important ways, often identified as New Left. It's more inward looking, and they talk a lot about self-negation and finding their own inner victimizer. And so then they have some of these like self-criticism sessions where they even abuse and hurt themselves within their own group. And then it, as in other countries, but maybe even more spectacularly in Japan than anywhere else. I mean, the United States had the Weather Underground. We know there's like Red Army fraction in Germany and some extreme groups in Europe, but in Japan, it's such a spectacular violent end to this radical New Left student activism. You have this part of the Japanese New Left that forms a Japan Red Army and goes on this international terrorism spree. They hijack airplanes, they bomb embassies, they have guns in Israel in the airport in Tel Aviv, and they just gun down some random people. And then domestically, another faction, the United Red Army, very famously in 1972, goes up in the mountains to start a revolution, but then they get involved in this self-criticism and they torture and kill a bunch of their members, and then they are holed up in this lodge, and there's this televised standoff, like 10 hours of live television with 1,500 police officers, and there's only like 4 guys in the house, and then finally they go in and kill them, and everyone watched this. And so I think that's often cited as the death blow to left-wing activism, that it's just totally delegitimized and nobody wants to be associated with it after this huge media spectacle. And I tend to agree that was quite an important event that really left an impression. I mean, I talked to Japanese people today and they remember that, even if they were a kid, they were like, I watched that on TV, or everyone points to that. I think it left a mark. I think that incredible, world-beating economic growth also has to be factored in explaining, why people turned away from protests, because it was just so much in your economic interest to avoid that kind of stuff, not be blackballed by corporations, and just sort of join the rat race and get yours, get your piece of the pie, more so than in other countries. And I think in other countries in the 70s, you have stagflation, and women are pushed into the workforce, and people's real incomes decline or just don't grow. But Japan's economic growth was able to. I mean, Japan had a recession in the 70s too, but they were able to recover and then blow this bubble and into the 80s. And so, I think in other countries, people had to confront maybe some of the problems with society or with capitalism earlier than in Japan. Japan had the luxury of sort of living the dream a little bit longer. Some people think maybe after these lost decades, protest culture in Japan maybe could make a revival. I think people were hopeful after the earthquake and tsunami, or with these anti-nuclear protests. And there's some signs of renewed protest activity in Japan, but nowhere near what it was in the past, and not yet close to what we see in some other parts of the world. And I think that's a legacy of high growth, but also this spectacular ending of the left-wing protests in the 60s that really went far to delegitimizing protests in Japan, maybe farther than other countries. There's other things I can mention. One other thing I'll mention is just like, I know the U.S. case, that's another case I know somewhat well. The Vietnam War was such a huge part of that, where there was a huge backlash against left-wing protests in the United States as well. But then sort of the loss of the Vietnam War and having to withdraw in such a humiliating fashion, those narratives were sort of, people went back and revised them, and then the protesters became kind of heroes who ended up on the right side of things. But in Japan, you don't have that. I mean, Japan was somewhat involved in supporting the Vietnam War in terms of economically and producing some of the goods, but they weren't directly fighting the war. They didn't have this lost war where then they had to go back and sort of valorize the protesters retroactively in the 80s and 90s, the way that happened in the US and perhaps in some other places. And so for a lot of people, anything that sounds or smells like left-wing protest, still to this day, it's just people want to keep their distance. They don't want to be associated with that.
So that's very interesting. I'm thinking that walking the snake, as you just said, requires a lot of discipline and lockstep forward motion, right? Which is, of course, what we know Japanese kids learn in kindergarten, so they can do this very well, and other places maybe not so much. So there was at the core, there was a very organized sort of the stereotypical Japanese ability to kind of go in lockstep, and then at the same time there was this outburst of violence, which is so un-Japanese in so many ways, right? We think of that as so. Vinicius has actually a very interesting question, which is about perception. And I'll read it. And I actually had a similar question. Seeing this picture and hearing the description of the protesters storming the Diet, I couldn't help but be reminded of the January insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. Obviously, the motivation and results were extremely different, but I'm curious about what dialogue was prevalent in Japan regarding our insurrection. So were there people in Japan that saw what happened in the U.S. and said, that reminds me, or was that not the case? Do you know?
Yeah. So I actually saw actually in another talk I gave, I had some slides about this, but on Japanese TV during and after the January 6th uprising in the United States, they were making direct comparisons between the 1960 Anpo protests and this storm, because these images are so similar in some ways. Crashing through and storming the national legislature building, this sacred temple of democracy or whatever in both cases. And where I saw this was on sort of conservative leaning Japanese kind of news infotainment programs. And they draw the cartoons and they have it on the cardboard that they hold up, and then they're showing the arrows, very Japanese style, kind of low tech television graphics, but they're just making a one-to-one comparison, right? They're like, oh, this is just like Anpo, and then Biden is like Ikeda, he's going to have to come in and resolve this, and which there are a lot of similarities in terms of what actually happened, but I think there are crucial differences which we need to keep in mind. First of all, the protesters are on kind of opposite ends of the political spectrum. And in the January 6th insurrection, these are people on the right, and they're sort of explicitly trying to overturn an election, substitute deliberative democracy with their own preferences, whereas the protesters in 1960 saw themselves as kind of defending democracy. And the ones on January 6th actually smashed into the Congress building itself, the Capitol building, whereas in 1960, they pushed into the gates, but they never actually tried to go into the building itself. They just wanted to occupy that public space in the plaza in front of the Diet building, which they felt, in their view, belonged to the people, and that police are not letting them in there. And so they saw themselves as defending democracy from sort of more of, those students were mostly left-wing activists. And so I think, and then also the role of the president, right? Trump was sort of urging on those January 6th insurrectionists. So the executive is sort of encouraging this attack on the national legislature, whereas Kishi was on the opposite side, and he was seen as the undemocratic one, and then these people were against him. So I think we have to keep those ideological differences and sort of the actual actions of what they did in mind.
So our colleague Alice has two questions. One is a clarification question, I would say, which is, was Ikeda's income doubling plan based on an earlier plan by Kishi, or did Ikeda think it up? So is this just sort of an LDP handover, or is this a new thing? And let me just ask the second one as well while I'm at it. Ellis, being a political scientist who's interested in U.S. Japan relations, he's wondering whether you deal in the book what might be, the most important legacy of the whole Anpo controversy, which is the ongoing polarization in the political culture over defense in the U.S.-Japan alliance. So how has it shaped the actual alliance, right? So is there a connection between these protests and how the alliance has evolved over time?
Yeah, thanks. And hi to Ellis, who I haven't seen in a number of years. Yeah, these are great questions. So yeah, the income doubling plan. So this was not Kishi's idea. It was always Ikeda's idea, as far as I can tell. This came out of Kojikai, sort of his think tank or brain trust. He had all these bureaucrats and former bureaucrats. Originally, Kojikai, this faction, now it's an LDP faction, but it starts out as kind of Ikeda's private think tank, or in Japanese, they call it his brain trust, his brain. And so Ikeda was coming up with income doubling with his advisors, and this was sort of going to be his big thing. He was going to try to become prime minister. And Kishi, of course, brings Ikeda into his cabinet because he recognizes that Ikeda's becoming more popular in the LDP. And so Ikeda does try to have Kishi do income doubling in 1959. Kishi's kind of lukewarm. He's not that into it. In any case, he's too worried about this treaty to really do much with it. So there is a connection where I think Kishi maybe put it in the platform for the upper house election at one point, but it never went anywhere. And at that point, even for Ikeda, it wasn't that well developed yet. Like they hadn't really thought of all the details and how to enlarge the social safety net and all the policies they would put in place. It was more of a slogan. But as far as I can tell, it's really coming from Ikeda himself and his brain trust of advisors, more than Kishi, who was always sort of, yeah, he agreed to put it as a slogan for the election, but other than that, he didn't do much with it. As for the second part, the U.S. Japan alliance, I think there's a lot of legacies from these protests. I do think perhaps the biggest one, in my view, is sort of just how the alliance is managed going forward. I think before these protests, the United States was clearly sort of the senior partner, Japan's a junior partner, and the US is very open about that. The way they deal with even prime ministers who come to the US is very kind of brusque and like, well, what are you going to do about it? You know, we won the war. I think they have to rethink that a lot. At least the language changes. I mean, people have portrayed Reischauer and Kennedy and this equal partnership. Well, it's all just rhetoric and nothing really changed. But I think things really did change behind the scenes. So there's a lot more behind the scenes consultation, which is in some cases hard for historians to even really track because it's all classified. A lot of it's still, I mean, I was in these US archives still classified, and in Japan, good luck. I mean, they've maybe even destroyed some of these documents, and especially these secret pacts. So, which, you know, Mitsuyaku in Japanese, and we've had some gradually trickling out over 60 years, inklings of lots of secret agreements. And I think leaders on both sides, as far as, you know, alliance management, they decide, all right, well, if we let people have any say or we put it before the diet, it's going to be a disaster. So we're just going to do it all behind the scenes. We're just going to do it all secretly. And when we need to change or adjust the alliance, tweak it here and there, or increase how much money Japan has to pay or something, we're just going to do it behind the scenes so that nobody can protest. And so I think that's a lasting legacy. And I think actually the Nixon shocks, this is something I talk a little bit about in the book, in 1970, where Nixon suddenly announces, that he's going to go to China, the biggest one of all, but also suspending the convertibility of dollars into gold and this tax on Japanese imports to the United States. The reason that's such a huge shock for Japan and actually, undoes the Sato cabinet in the end is because they had been used to having a lot more kind of secret coordination behind the scenes. And so Nixon kind of trampled on that, and that caused a big problem. But that sort of demonstrates how things had already shifted by that point in this alliance, where we're going to keep everything running smoothly behind the scenes.
Interesting. And that also answers the question we have, why weren't there more protests in the 1970 revision? Because it was done smoothly and behind the scenes, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So final question goes to Ruth. And she has a great question. Has there been any research, she wonders, on the post-movement careers of the Zengakuren leaders? So for instance, she recalls her hearing that Mitarai-san, the CEO of Canon, was a very active Zengakuren person. And then also I mentioned the professor of economics who was, very influential in the 80s in economic policy making, who was one of these leaders to defend or attack the Todai library. So do you know what happened of these guys that were, throwing stones at the police in 1960?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think the answer is kind of no. I don't know of any systematic research that examines a number of case studies of different people. I think that would be really interesting if there are researchers out there to sort of more systematically look at this. But my sense from a lot of these anecdotes, some people were blackballed and kept out of entering corporations, which, as we know in the Japanese system, that can be very damaging. If you miss the boat right at the beginning, it's very hard to get onto a career track later on. But for most people, it was fine. Like, even if you were in one of these radical leftist sects, as long as you stop once you graduate, there was a kind of tolerance. I think it was almost part of the culture. This even goes back maybe to the 20s, like university, and it's in some ways still Japanese university culture. This is a 4-year period where you can sort of relax and do crazy stuff before you have to enter the workforce and get serious. So as long as you stopped once you graduated, I think it was fine, amazingly. And like you say, people rose up through the corporate ladder with no consequences. But some of the people who kept doing it or went to graduate school and were there for more of the extreme iterations, they were frozen out. But for most people, even people who got involved in very violent inter-sectarian violence between student groups or with police, very little consequences. Some people were even arrested and had suspended sentences. But as long as they joined the rat race and said everything correctly after that, they ended up with very conventional careers. And oftentimes by the 80s, they're very conservative supporters of conventional LDP politics and doing what's best for the company. So I think it's quite interesting to see that process as a social process.
Yeah, I think actually that Germany was a little bit different, similar. Sorry, there was a hardcore that stayed hardcore, but a lot of people kind of did this while they were at school, and then they kind of pursued a corporate career afterwards. So I guess that happens. So Nick, unfortunately, time is up. We have 30 more questions that I could ask. I will share them with you later. Audience, thank you very much for joining us today. A terrific conversation. And yes, the book, Japan at the Crossroads. is available at Amazon, and of course Harvard University Press. In 2 weeks, the aforementioned Alice Krauss will take on Andrew Orrs, and they will discuss sort of the end of that story arc, Nick, that you started drawing here, with the topic of America's aging allies. And so is the Anpo toast, right? And so because there's a lot of demographic change in Asia, and America is also changing. So everybody, I'll see you again in 2 weeks from now. And until then, please stay safe and do well. And thanks again, Professor Nick Kapur from highly illuminating. Thank you.